Welcome to Fallout HOA. I'm Michael Vincent. Today I'm going to tell you about Richard Ramos, a county sheriff who accidentally discovered that the HOA president in his own neighborhood had been selling common area land to her son for $1. $1. For a parcel worth hundreds of thousands. She didn't know Richard had a habit of checking property records, and she definitely didn't know that the neighbor she'd sent a violation letter to last year about his mailbox color was the county sheriff. This isn't a story about using a badge for revenge. This is about how an ordinary homeowner used public records, patience, and the legal system to bring down someone who'd been stealing from the entire community for years. If you stick around until the end, I'll show you how to check your own HOA. Free, legal, and it might save you thousands.
County Recorder's Office, Tuesday afternoon. I was there for my own paperwork refinance documents. Nothing exciting. The line moved slowly, the way government lines always do, and I had time to kill. So I did what I've done for 20 years in law enforcement. I pulled up the public terminal and started browsing recent deed transfers in my zip code. Professional habit. Most people scroll through social media when they're bored. I scroll through property records. You'd be surprised what shows up when you know where to look. Most of it was routine. A house sale on Maple Street, an inheritance transfer on the east side, a bank foreclosure is sitting in limbo for months. I was about to close the window when a name caught my eye. Teresa Brooks. I knew that name. She was the HOA president in my neighborhood, had been for 8 years. Last year, she cited me for having the wrong shade of beige on my mailbox post. Beige? That's the kind of interaction I'd had with Teresa Brooks. The transaction on my screen was a quitclaim deed, grantor Teresa Brooks, grantee Tyler Brooks, consideration $1. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Family transfers at nominal value aren't unusual. People use them for estate planning, avoiding probate, and keeping things simple. But something about this one felt off. I clicked on the parcel number to pull up the property details, and that's when the feeling in my gut went from curiosity to concern. The parcel wasn't a residential lot. It wasn't part of Teresa's home property. According to the map, it was a small piece of land on the southwest corner of our subdivision, right where the overflow parking area and a strip of green space sat. Land I'd always assumed belonged to the HOA. Land that every homeowner in our community had been paying to maintain through our monthly dues. I zoomed in on the plat map, double-checking the boundaries. No mistake. Teresa Brooks had transferred a piece of what looked like a common area to her 26-year-old son. A quitclaim deed makes this kind of thing dangerously easy. Unlike other property transfers, it doesn't require the seller to prove they actually own what they're selling. You file the paperwork, the county records it, and unless someone challenges it, the transfer stands. That's why it's convenient for legitimate family transfers, and why it's convenient for fraud. I sat back and considered two possibilities. One, Teresa legitimately owned this parcel through some arrangement I wasn't aware of, and the transfer was perfectly legal. Two, she had just transferred community property to her own family, and nobody in our neighborhood had any idea. The first option seemed unlikely. HOA common areas are owned by the association, not by individual board members. The president doesn't get to treat them like personal assets. But I'd been wrong before. I needed documentation. I flagged down the clerk and requested additional records, the original subdivision plat from when the neighborhood was developed, and the chain of title for the parcel in question. She told me it would take about 15 minutes. I said I'd wait. While she disappeared into the back, I pulled out my phone and searched for our HOA's CCNR, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that governed the community. I'd signed them when I bought my house, same as everyone else. I'd never actually read them. That was about to change. The clerk came back with a stack of papers. The original plat map was dated 1987, when the subdivision was first developed. I found the parcel in question and traced my finger along the designation, right there, in faded but legible type, common area HOA maintained. Not a private lot, not Teresa's property, Community land, owned collectively by every homeowner who'd ever paid dues into the association. I flipped to the chain of title. The parcel had been deeded to the HOA at the time of development and had remained in the association's name ever since until 3 weeks ago, when Teresa Brooks signed it over to her son. I gathered the documents and walked out of the recorder's office without finishing my refinance paperwork. That could wait. This couldn't. I sat in my truck in the parking lot, engine off, staring at the plat map spread across my steering wheel. 12 years I'd lived in that neighborhood. 12 years of dues, $300 a month, every month. Part of that money maintained the common areas, the overflow parking where we held community garage sales, the green space where kids played on weekends. I'd paid into that land for over a decade, and so had every one of my neighbors. Now it belonged to Tyler Brooks, a kid I'd never seen at a single HOA meeting, who, as far as I knew, didn't even live in the subdivision. I could have let it go, told myself it wasn't my business. I wasn't there as a sheriff. I was there as a homeowner doing personal errands. Getting involved would mean questions, complications, and potential accusations of overreach. But here's the thing about fraud. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I'd spent 20 years learning to recognize it. The vague paperwork, the family connection, the nominal consideration is designed to avoid scrutiny. Every red flag was there. I started my truck and headed home. I had research to do. I spread the documents across my kitchen table that night, organizing them into stacks, plat map, chain of title, deed transfer. My wife Julie glanced over from the living room, saw the look on my face, and decided not to ask. I pulled up the HOA's website on my laptop and started digging into the governance documents I'd ignored since the day I signed my mortgage papers. The CC&R was 53 pages of dense legal language. I found what I was looking for in Article 7, Section 4. The words were clear enough that even without a law degree, there was no room for interpretation. Common areas shall be owned by the association for the benefit of all members. No portion of common area may be sold, leased, mortgaged, or otherwise transferred without the prior written approval of at least 75% of the total voting membership. 75%. That meant 3/4 of every homeowner in our subdivision would have had to vote yes before a single square foot of common property could change hands. I'd never received a ballot. I'd never seen an agenda item. I'd never heard a whisper about selling any part of our shared land. I navigated to the meeting minutes archive. Our HOA posted them online, going back 5 years, a requirement under state law. I opened every document, one by one, searching for any reference to property sales, land transfers, or disposition of common areas. 5 years of meetings, budget discussions, landscaping contracts, pool maintenance schedules, arguments about holiday decorations and fence heights. Not a single mention of selling the southwest parcel. Not one vote, not one discussion. According to the official record, the transfer that showed up at the county recorder's office had never been authorized by the membership. The next question was obvious. If the HOA never approved this sale, how did Teresa get the authority to sign the deed? I pulled up the county assessor's website and searched for the parcel's tax history. For years, the tax bills had been sent to our HOA's management company and paid out of association funds, meaning every homeowner's dues had contributed to maintaining ownership. But this year's bill showed a different name, Tyler Brooks. The transfer wasn't just paperwork sitting in a file somewhere. It had already changed hands in the eyes of the county tax system. Teresa Brooks had been president for 8 years. She had access to association documents, letterhead, and the corporate seal. She knew how the system worked because she'd been running it. If she wanted to sign a deed transferring common property to her son, who would question her? No bank is involved, no escrow, no third-party oversight, just a piece of paper with her signature, filed quietly. And unless someone happened to be browsing property records on a slow Tuesday afternoon, completely invisible to everyone who actually owned that land. 237 households. That's how many families had been paying into this association, contributing to the maintenance of common areas that were supposed to belong to all of us. Every homeowner who'd ever written a check for HOA dues had a stake in that parcel, and none of them had any idea that the woman collecting their money had signed it over to her own family. The scope of the betrayal wasn't personal, it was collective. Every neighbor I waved to on my morning jog, every family at the community pool, Every retiree who'd chosen this neighborhood for its stability and its promise of shared ownership, all of us had been paying for land that now belonged to Tyler Brooks. I had two options. The first was to handle this as a law enforcement matter, open an official investigation, involve the district attorney's office. But I lived in the same neighborhood as the suspect. I'd had personal conflicts with her. Defense attorneys love the phrase conflict of interest, and Teresa's lawyer would have a field day painting me as a vindictive neighbor using his badge to settle a grudge. The second option was to approach this as a homeowner, bring it up at the next meeting, demand answers publicly. But Teresa had allies on the board, relationships throughout the neighborhood, and years of practice controlling the narrative. If I came at her without enough evidence, she'd spin it as a personal attack. Neither option was clean. Both could backfire. And if this wasn't an isolated incident, if there were other transfers I hadn't found yet, moving too fast could give her time to cover tracks I hadn't even discovered. I closed my laptop and gathered the papers into a folder. Tomorrow, I'd start building a case. Tonight, I'd sit with the weight of what I'd found and figure out how to carry it without dropping it.
I'm Michael Vincent, your storyteller today here on Fallout HOA. If you were in Richard's situation right now, what would you do? Drop your answer in the comments below. Let's see whose solution is the best. Thank you all. Now, let's see what Richard decides.
The next morning, I sat in my home office before sunrise, staring at a blank legal pad. Two options on the table, both flawed, but as the coffee cooled in my mug, a third option started to take shape. What if I didn't approach this as either a sheriff or a typical homeowner? What if I built the case as a concerned citizen, using only public records and rights available to any member of the association, and then handed the whole package to the district attorney's office for them to decide no badge involved, no personal confrontation, just documentation, delivered through proper channels, with my role limited to witness rather than investigator? The reasoning was simple. If I used my position to access records that ordinary citizens couldn't touch, a defense attorney could argue the evidence was compromised, but everything I'd found so far came from public sources: the county recorder's office, the assessor's website, the HOA's own posted documents. Any homeowner with internet access and patience could have discovered the same things. If I kept it that way, whatever I found would stand on its own merits. And when I referred it to the DA, there'd be no conflict of interest to muddy the waters. I started making a list of what I still needed. HOA financial statements state law required associations to make these available to any member upon request. A complete history of the parcel, including any prior transfers I might have missed. And background on Teresa's authority as president. What powers did the board actually grant her? And had she operated within them? The CC&R outlined the rules, but I needed to see how they'd been applied in practice. I drafted an email to the HOA management company, formal but polite. I asked for the past 3 years of financial statements, the current operating budget, and copies of all board resolutions related to property transactions. I cited the relevant state statute giving homeowners the right to inspect association records. I didn't mention my profession. I didn't explain why I wanted them. I just asked, the way any dues-paying member was entitled to ask. By mid-morning, I had a reply confirming they'd provide the documents within 10 business days. While I waited, I went back through every HOA communication I'd received since moving into the neighborhood, meeting notices I'd ignored, budget summaries I'd barely glanced at, annual election ballots I'd filled out without recognizing a single candidate. I wasn't proud of how little attention I'd paid over the years, but I also knew I wasn't alone. That kind of apathy is what allows problems to go unnoticed, and I was determined not to be part of it anymore. I spent the next several days building a timeline, when the subdivision was developed, when each parcel was designated as a common area, when Teresa first joined the board, and when she became president. I cross-referenced property records with meeting minutes, looking for any discussion of land sales or asset transfers. The pattern was consistent: no votes, no discussions, no public acknowledgement of the recent transfer. According to the official record, the southwest parcel had simply changed hands without the membership's knowledge or consent. The financial statements arrived 8 days later, attached to an email from the management company. I downloaded the files and started reading. Balance sheets, income statements, and reserve fund summaries. Most of it was routine, the kind of numbers you'd expect from a functioning association. Then I reached page 14 of the most recent annual report and stopped. Under the section titled Non-Operating Revenue, there was a single line item that made my stomach drop. Land sale proceeds, $1, transfer to reserve fund. They'd recorded it, not hidden it, not buried it in some obscure account, recorded it openly as though it were a legitimate transaction. $1 in revenue from the sale of association property, deposited into the reserve fund like it was normal business, which meant Teresa had either believed nobody would ever read these reports closely enough to notice, or she believed that even if someone did notice, nobody would understand what it meant. For however long this line item had been sitting there, she'd apparently been right. I printed the page, highlighted the line, and added it to my growing folder. The picture was getting clearer. Whoever had signed that deed had also created a paper trail that made it look routine within the HOA's own records. That took planning. That took confidence in how the system worked, and it raised questions I couldn't answer yet. Was this an isolated decision, or part of something larger? Were there other transactions buried in years of financial reports that nobody had bothered to examine? I didn't know. But the fact that I was even asking meant I couldn't stop until I found out. I looked at the folder on my desk. Property records, meeting minutes, financial statements, a timeline that showed no authorization for a transfer that had already been recorded and taxed. None of it proved criminal intent. That wasn't my call to make, but it painted a picture of something that didn't add up, something that deserved scrutiny from people with the authority to investigate properly. My job now was to keep building, keep documenting, and make sure that when I handed this over, there were no gaps for anyone to hide in. Quarterly HOA meeting, Thursday evening. I arrived 15 minutes early and signed in at the folding table near the entrance of the community clubhouse. The room smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and stale coffee from the pot someone had set up in the corner. About 30 homeowners had shown up, a decent turnout for a meeting with nothing controversial on the agenda. I took a seat in the third row, close enough to see faces but far enough back to observe without drawing attention. I wasn't wearing my uniform, I wasn't carrying my badge. Tonight, I was just another resident with questions. Teresa Brooks sat at the front table with two other board members, Carol Flores, the secretary, and a man named Donald Pratt who handled the architectural committee. Teresa wore a burgundy blazer and reading glasses perched on her nose, shuffling through papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd run these meetings for years. She looked up occasionally to greet arriving homeowners by name, her smile warm and controlled. This was her room, her agenda, her show. I watched her and wondered how many of these meetings she'd conducted while quietly transferring community assets to her family. Maybe none, maybe all of them. I didn't know yet, but I intended to find out. The meeting opened with the usual formalities. Approval of the previous quarter's minutes, treasurer's report on the operating budget, an update on the landscaping contract renewal that had been under negotiation for months. Teresa moved through each item with brisk professionalism, fielding questions, redirecting tangents, and keeping things on schedule. She was good at this, confident without being condescending, organized without being rigid. If you didn't know what I knew, you'd think she was exactly what an HOA president should be. The agenda moved to new business, then to open forum, the portion of the meeting where homeowners could raise concerns not covered elsewhere. A woman in the front row complained about parking violations near the pool. A man asked about the timeline for repainting the entrance sign. Teresa handled each question with patience, promising follow-ups and thanking residents for their input. When the room fell quiet, I raised my hand. Teresa's eyes found me immediately. Something flickered across her face, recognition, maybe a hint of wariness before her expression settled back into neutral courtesy. "Yes, Mr. Ramos," she said. I noticed she used my name without checking the sign-in sheet. She knew who I was. Whether she knew why I was asking questions remained to be seen. I kept my voice even. I was reviewing public records recently and came across a deed transfer involving a parcel in our community, the southwest corner, the overflow parking and green space area. According to county records, it was transferred to an individual named Tyler Brooks about a month ago. For $1. I paused, letting the words settle. "Can you explain what that transaction was about?" The room went quiet. A few heads turned toward me, then toward Teresa. She didn't flinch, but I saw her fingers tighten slightly on the papers in front of her. "That was an administrative matter," she said, "a transfer that the board handled appropriately under its authority." And her tone was smooth, rehearsed. She'd anticipated this question, maybe not from me specifically, but from someone. "The details are complex, and I don't think this is the right forum to get into legal technicalities." I nodded slowly, as if considering her response. "The CCNR requires 75% homeowner approval before any common area can be sold or transferred. Was that vote conducted? Because I've gone through the meeting minutes for the past 5 years, and I don't see any record of it." Teresa's smile thinned. Mr. Ramos, I appreciate your concern, but the board has the authority to handle certain administrative functions without bringing every detail to a general vote. If you have specific concerns, I'd encourage you to submit them in writing to the management company, and we'll be happy to provide clarification. She glanced down at her agenda. "Now, if there are no other questions, I have the same question." The voice came from the back of the room. I turned to see an older man rising from his seat. White hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of posture that suggested decades of sitting in professional meetings. Jim Brennan, I knew him by sight, though we'd never spoken. Retired CPA, former board member. According to the records I'd reviewed, he'd been on the HOA board twice in the past 15 years before stepping down for health reasons. Jim walked slowly toward the front of the room, his voice carrying without effort. "I've served on this board, Teresa. I know the bylaws. Common property sales require a member vote, period. That's not a technicality, that's fundamental governance." He stopped a few feet from the board table, hands in his pockets. "So, either that vote happened and wasn't properly noticed, or it happened and wasn't recorded, or it didn't happen at all. Which is it?" The room had gone completely still. Teresa's composure held, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes, weighing responses, measuring risks. "Jim, this really isn't the appropriate setting for—" "It's a public meeting," Jim said. "Members are asking about association property. Seems like exactly the appropriate setting to me." Teresa glanced at Carol Flores, who was staring at the table in front of her. Donald Pratt had leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, clearly unwilling to intervene. For the first time since I'd started watching her, Teresa Brooks didn't have a smooth answer ready. The silence stretched for 3 seconds, then 5. Finally, she straightened her papers and said, "I think we should table this discussion until we can provide a complete response. The board will review the matter and follow up with any concerned homeowners." She looked out at the room. "Thank you all for coming. Meeting adjourned." People began gathering their things, murmuring to each other in low voices. I stayed in my seat, watching Teresa pack her papers into a leather portfolio and exchange a few quiet words with Carol. She didn't look at me again, but as she walked toward the exit, her pace was faster than it had been coming in. After the meeting, 4 homeowners approached me in the parking lot, asking what I knew. Jim Brennan shook my hand and said, "I always thought something was off about the way she ran things, just never had anything concrete." I told him I was still gathering information. He nodded and handed me his card. "If you need help with the numbers," he said. "That's what I did for 40 years. I drove home with the windows down, replaying the meeting in my head. Teresa had controlled the room for 8 years. Tonight, for the first time. She'd lost control, even if just for a moment. That moment was enough. The questions were out in the open now. And questions, once asked publicly, don't disappear just because someone adjourns the meeting.
Richard just asked his questions. In public. Teresa deflected, but Jim Brennan stood up and pushed harder. The room felt it. Everyone felt it. Now the question is, if you were in Richard's position, what would you do next? Push the momentum while it's hot? Or step back and let the pressure build on its own? Drop your answer in the comments below. Let's see whose solution is the best.
The weekend after the meeting, Jim Brennan invited me to his house. He lived 3 streets over in a brick ranch with an American flag by the front door and a workshop in the garage that smelled like sawdust and motor oil. We sat at his kitchen table with laptops open, property records spread between us, and a pot of coffee that we emptied twice before noon. Jim had spent 40 years auditing financial statements for mid-sized companies. He knew how to follow money, and more importantly, he knew how to spot when money wasn't going where it should. We started with the parcel I'd already identified, the southwest corner. Jim pulled up the county recorder's database and walked me through the chain of title, pointing out details I'd missed on my first review. The transfer to Tyler Brooks was dated 6 weeks ago, but there was something else in the history that caught his attention. A mortgage satisfaction filed 3 years earlier on a parcel with an adjacent number. "That's odd," Jim said, tapping the screen. "Common areas don't usually carry mortgages. Let me dig into this one." What he found made me sit back in my chair. The adjacent parcel, a narrow strip along the southern boundary, had been transferred in 2021. Same structure, quitclaim deed from the HOA to an LLC called Brooks Property Holdings. Jim searched the Secretary of State's database. Registered agent Tyler Brooks. Business address, Teresa's home. He kept digging. 2019. Another transfer, a small section of the eastern green space near the community entrance. Same LLC, same nominal consideration. 3 transfers over 5 years. Each one moving a piece of community property into private hands through the same method. The parcels weren't large individually, a few thousand square feet each. But what struck me wasn't the size, it was the consistency. Same documentation approach, same family entity receiving the property, same absence of any recorded vote in the meeting minutes. Whatever this was, it hadn't happened by accident. "This is what we used to call salami tactics," Jim said, leaning back in his chair. "You don't take the whole thing at once that's too obvious. You take thin slices, small enough that nobody notices any single cut." He pulled up the county assessor's valuation for each parcel and did quick math on a napkin. Conservative estimate, the 3 parcels together were worth somewhere between $180,000 and $220,000. Property that had been maintained through decades of homeowner dues, transferred for a combined total of $3. I sat with that number for a long moment. Every homeowner in the neighborhood had contributed to those common areas. And while we were paying our monthly dues, trusting that the money was being managed responsibly, pieces of what we collectively owned had been quietly moving into different hands. Jim must have seen the question forming on my face. "You're wondering how nobody caught this earlier," he said. "I was on the board twice. I reviewed budgets, sat through more meetings than I can count, and I never saw it." He shook his head slowly. "Nobody was looking. We trusted the president to handle administrative matters. We assumed someone else was checking the details. The information we had found wasn't hidden. Property records are public county assessor websites, Secretary of State databases, and HOA financial statements. Anyone with time and attention could connect the same pieces we had. Most people just never think to look. I hadn't for 12 years. Jim printed everything and organized it into a timeline. 2019, 2021, 2024. Each transfer filed quietly with the county. Each was recorded in the HOA's financial statements as a $1 land sale. No votes, no notices to homeowners. The documentation painted a concerning picture, but what it meant, whether it constituted criminal conduct or civil violations or something else entirely, wasn't for me to decide. That distinction mattered. I wasn't there as an investigator. I wasn't building a prosecution. I was a homeowner who had stumbled onto records that raised serious questions. And my job was to make sure those questions reached people with the authority to answer them properly. The DA's office had resources I didn't subpoena: power, forensic accountants, the ability to compel testimony. They could examine intent, establish timelines, and determine whether laws had been broken. All I could do was hand them the documented pattern and let them take it from there. I gathered the papers into a folder and thanked Jim for his help. He walked me to the door and paused with his hand on the frame. "You know she's going to fight back," he said. "People like Teresa don't go quietly. The moment she realizes how much you've found, she's going to try to discredit you, control the narrative, make this about anything other than the transfers." I nodded. I'd been thinking the same thing. "That's why everything goes to the DA," I said. "I'm not going to debate this publicly. Let the system do what it's supposed to do." Jim shook my hand. "If you need me to confirm what we found, I will." I told him I appreciated it. A week ago, I'd been working alone, unsure if anyone else would care, Now I had an ally with 40 years of financial expertise and a willingness to go on record. In situations like this, having someone in your corner makes all the difference. I was at my desk Monday morning when my phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was the HOA distribution list, the one that went out to all 237 households in the subdivision. Subject line, urgent protecting our community from abuse of power. I knew what it was before I opened it. Teresa had decided to go on offense. The email was 2 pages long. She must have spent the entire weekend drafting it, refining every phrase to strike the right balance of righteous indignation and wounded dignity. As many of you may have witnessed at our last quarterly meeting, I was subjected to a public interrogation by Sheriff Richard Ramos regarding routine administrative matters, and I have since consulted with legal counsel about the harassment my family and I have experienced. And this appears to be a personal vendetta, disguised as community concern by someone using his professional position to intimidate a volunteer board member. She never addressed the substance of the questions, not a word about whether the transfers had been authorized, not a sentence explaining how community property ended up in her son's LLC, just accusations, deflections, and an appeal to sympathy. The closing paragraph asked homeowners to stand with your dedicated volunteers against those who would abuse their power for personal grievances. It was signed by Teresa Brooks, HOA president, with her phone number and email for anyone who wanted to reach out with support. I read it twice, then set the phone down. I wasn't surprised. Jim had warned me this was coming. I recognized the pattern immediately, DARVO. Some call it deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. Teresa was running it step by step. The temptation to respond was strong. I could have replied to the entire list, laying out the evidence point by point, the transfers, the LLC, the missing votes, the financial statements that recorded community property being sold for pocket change. I had documentation that spoke for itself, but responding would have been exactly what Teresa wanted. It would have turned this into a public argument, a he said she said that she could shape to her advantage. She'd been managing this community's narrative for 8 years. I wasn't going to beat her at a game she'd mastered. Instead, I forwarded the email to my contact at the DA's office with a brief note. This may be relevant to the referral I submitted last week. Flagging for your review? Then I closed my email and went back to work. Whatever Teresa was trying to accomplish with that message, she'd just created another piece of documentation for the file. The reply all responses started trickling in by mid-afternoon. Jim Brennan wrote a measured 2-paragraph response noting that legitimate questions had been raised about property transfers and that transparent answers, not accusations, would resolve the matter. A woman named Patricia Vaughn asked why the board hadn't simply provided documentation at the meeting if everything was in order. Most other responses were predictable longtime residents expressing support for Teresa, newer homeowners staying quiet. Carol Flores sent a brief message on behalf of the board, stating that they were reviewing the matter internally and would provide updates at the appropriate time. It was the kind of non-answer designed to make the conversation go away. But conversations don't disappear just because someone wants them to. They simmer, and sometimes they boil over. By Wednesday, I'd received personal emails from several homeowners asking what I knew and how they could help. 2 mentioned they'd noticed discrepancies in HOA financial reports years ago, but hadn't known who to tell. I didn't share details with any of them. The referral to the DA was pending, but I thanked each person for reaching out and told them to document anything they remembered. If this went further, written records would matter. Thursday evening, my phone rang. The caller ID showed the county district attorney's office. I stepped onto my back porch and answered. The voice on the other end was professional, unhurried. Mr. Ramos, this is Assistant DA Margaret Chen. We've reviewed the materials you submitted, and I wanted to let you know we're opening a formal investigation into the property transfers you documented. She paused. We'll need you to come in for a statement as a witness, not in any law enforcement capacity. Can you make time tomorrow afternoon? I told her I could. She gave me the details and thanked me for bringing the matter to their attention. Before she hung up, she added one more thing. We've also received a complaint from Mrs. Brooks alleging harassment. We'll be looking into that as well. I want you to know that both matters will be handled independently and thoroughly. I told her I understood. I'd expected nothing less. I stood on the porch for a long moment after the call ended, watching the sun drop behind the roofline of the house across the street. Teresa had tried to turn this into a story about me, about my badge, my motives, my supposed vendetta. But the DA wasn't interested in her narrative. They were interested in documents, timelines, transfers that didn't add up, the evidence I'd gathered as a homeowner, using nothing but public records and the rights every member of our association shared. She'd thrown her punch. It hadn't landed. And now the system was moving forward. If you were in Richard's position watching someone try to flip the script and make you the villain, could you have kept your cool? Drop your answer in the comments below. Let's see whose solution is the best. 6 weeks passed. The investigation moved at its own pace, slower than I wanted, faster than I'd feared. I gave my statement to the DA's office on a Friday afternoon, sitting in a conference room with Assistant DA Margaret Chen and an investigator named Torres, who took notes without saying much. They asked me to walk through how I'd found the first transfer, what led me to look for others, and how I'd connected the pieces. I told them everything, starting with Tuesday afternoon at the county recorder's office and ending with the timeline Jim and I had built. They had copies of all the documents I'd submitted. Torres had already pulled additional records I hadn't known to request. The investigation had expanded beyond what I'd given them. I asked how long the process might take. Chen gave me the answer I expected. It depends on what they found, on whether other parties were involved, on how cooperative the subjects were when approached. She thanked me for my patience and said they'd be in touch when there were developments worth sharing. I drove home and tried not to think about it every day. I wasn't entirely successful. The charges came down on a Wednesday morning in early spring. I heard about it the way most people in the neighborhood did, through the local news. A reporter had picked up the story after the DA's office issued a press release. The headline was straightforward: HOA president charged with theft, fraud, and property transfer scheme. I read the article 3 times, letting each word settle. Teresa Brooks faced 5 counts. 3 counts of theft of property exceeding $50,000, one for each parcel transferred to her son's LLC. 1 count of filing fraudulent documents with the county recorder. 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty as an officer of the homeowners association. All felonies. Tyler Brooks faced 3 counts of receiving stolen property and 1 count of conspiracy. The DA's office estimated the total value of the transferred property at approximately $195,000. I wasn't present when Teresa was served. Jim told me about it later. She'd been in her front yard, talking to a neighbor, when 2 deputies from a different jurisdiction pulled up with the paperwork. She'd gone pale, he said, stood there holding the documents without reading them, watching the deputies drive away. The neighbor had asked if everything was okay. Teresa had said it was a misunderstanding. Then she'd gone inside and hadn't come out for the rest of the day. The arraignment was scheduled for 2 weeks later at the county courthouse. I attended as a citizen observer, sitting in the back row of the gallery with Jim and a handful of other homeowners who'd made the drive. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected: wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights, an American flag hanging limply beside the judge's bench. Teresa entered through a side door with her attorney, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit who guided her to the defense table with a hand on her elbow. She wore a gray dress and no jewelry. I'd never seen her without her signature burgundy blazer. Tyler came in separately, accompanied by a younger attorney who looked barely old enough to have passed the bar. He kept his eyes on the floor as he walked to the table, standing slightly apart from his mother, as if proximity might implicate him further. The judge read the charges. Teresa's attorney entered a plea of not guilty on all counts. Tyler's attorney did the same. Bail was set $50,000 for Teresa, $25,000 for Tyler. Both were posted within hours. Outside the courthouse, a local news crew had set up on the steps. Teresa walked past them without a word, her attorney shielding her with an umbrella even though it wasn't raining. Tyler followed a few steps behind, one hand raised to block the camera. They got into separate cars and drove away in different directions. No statements, no explanations. Just the quiet retreat of people whose carefully constructed world had started to collapse. I stood on the courthouse steps and watched them go. Jim was beside me, hands in his pockets, squinting against the afternoon sun. "How do you feel?" he asked. I thought about the question for a long moment before answering. The honest answer was complicated. There was satisfaction, certainly the validation that comes when a system works the way it's supposed to. But there was something else too, something heavier. I'd lived 3 streets away from Teresa for 12 years. We'd waved to each other at the mailbox. She'd complimented Julie's garden more than once. I'd sat through meetings where she'd seemed genuinely dedicated to making the neighborhood better. And all that time, according to the charges, she'd been quietly transferring our shared property to her own family. I didn't know if she'd convinced herself it was justified somehow, or if she simply hadn't cared. Either way, the person I thought I'd known didn't match the person described in the indictment. I feel tired, I told Jim. It was the truth. And I feel like this isn't over yet. He nodded slowly. The trial will take months, maybe longer if they fight it. He paused. But the hard part's done. The evidence is in the system. The charges are filed. Whatever happens next, she can't make this disappear. I looked out at the parking lot, watching the last of the news crew pack up their equipment. Teresa's car was long gone. Tyler's too. The courthouse steps were almost empty now, just a few attorneys in dark suits heading to their next appointments. The drama was over for the day. What remained was process motions, hearings, discovery, and negotiation. The slow machinery of accountability is grinding forward at its own pace. I'd spent months building a case I wasn't authorized to prosecute. I'd handed it to people whose job was to determine what it meant. And now, finally, the determination was being made. Not by me, not by Teresa, by the system that existed for exactly this purpose. I thanked Jim for coming and told him I'd keep him updated. Then I walked to my truck and drove home, the radio off, the windows down, thinking about what comes after someone is charged with a crime, and what comes after a community learns it can't trust the people it elected to lead. 8 months after the arraignment, the case resolved without a trial. Teresa Brooks accepted a plea agreement 3 weeks before jury selection was scheduled to begin. Her attorney had spent months filing motions, requesting delays, and challenging the admissibility of various documents. None of it had worked. The evidence was too clear. The paper trail is too complete. In the end, facing the prospect of a public trial and the near certainty of conviction on multiple felony counts, Teresa chose the path that minimized her exposure. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony theft and 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty. The remaining charges were dropped as part of the agreement. The sentence came down 2 weeks later, 5 years probation, $185,000 in restitution to the Homeowners Association, a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in the state, no jail time, which disappointed some of my neighbors. But the judge noted Teresa's age, lack of prior criminal history, and the fact that the stolen property could be recovered. It wasn't the maximum penalty, but it was accountability, documented and enforceable, attached to her name for the rest of her life. Tyler's case resolved separately. He pleaded to a single misdemeanor count of receiving stolen property in exchange for cooperation with the investigation and testimony about how the transfers had been structured. His sentence was 2 years probation and 200 hours of community service. The LLC he'd registered Brooks' property holdings was dissolved. The 3 parcels that had been transferred were deeded back to the Homeowners Association, their titles cleared, their ownership restored to where it had always belonged. The HOA held a special meeting a month after the sentencing. Teresa wasn't there, obviously. Neither was Carol Flores, who had resigned from the board shortly after the charges were filed, citing health reasons. The remaining members, Donald Pratt and 2 others who'd been largely uninvolved in the transfers, presided over an agenda focused entirely on reform. Jim Brennan had drafted a set of proposed bylaw amendments, and the membership voted on each one in turn. The changes were substantial. Any transaction involving association property would now require an independent audit before approval. All property transfers would need a 75% member vote, conducted by mail ballot with at least 30 days' notice. Financial statements would be reviewed quarterly by a rotating committee of homeowners rather than just the board, and a new whistleblower provision was added, protecting any member who reported suspected misconduct from retaliation by the board. The amendments passed with 83% approval. It wasn't a perfect system, no system is, but it was better than what we'd had. It was designed by people who'd learned the hard way what happens when oversight fails. Jim was elected interim president until the next annual meeting. He didn't want the job, he told me afterward, but nobody else with the experience and credibility was willing to step up. Somebody has to make sure this sticks, he said. Might as well be someone who understands what went wrong. I told him. The neighborhood was lucky to have him. He shrugged and said he'd rather be fishing. But he showed up to every meeting, reviewed every document, and answered every homeowner's question with the patience of someone who remembered what it felt like to be ignored. The community healed slowly. Some neighbors still defended Teresa, insisting she'd been railroaded by people with grudges. Others wanted to relitigate every decision she'd ever made, looking for additional misconduct that might have been missed. Most people just wanted to move on to pay their dues, use the pool, attend the occasional meeting, and trust that the people in charge were doing their jobs honestly. That trust would take time to rebuild, but at least now, there were structures in place to verify it. I ran into Patricia Vaughn at the mailbox a few weeks after the bylaw vote. She was the homeowner who had asked the pointed question during Teresa's email counterattack. Why hadn't the board just provided documentation if everything was legitimate? She thanked me for pushing the issue when it would have been easier to let it go. I told her I'd just followed the evidence. She shook her head. Plenty of people see things that don't look right, she said. Most of them convince themselves it's not their problem. You didn't. I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I just nodded and wished her a good evening. Julie was waiting on the porch when I got home, a glass of iced tea in her hand and another one sweating on the railing for me. She'd lived through the whole thing, the late nights with documents spread across the kitchen table, the tension after Teresa's email, the quiet months of waiting for the legal system to do its work. She hadn't complained once. "How are you feeling?" she asked as I sat down beside her. It was the same question Jim had asked outside the courthouse, and I gave her a more honest answer than I'd given him. "I'm glad it's over," I said. "And I keep thinking about how close it came to never being discovered at all. If I hadn't been at the recorder's office that day, if I hadn't decided to check the property records, if I'd seen the transfer and convinced myself it wasn't my business." I took a sip of tea. She could have kept going for years, decades, maybe, slicing off pieces of what belonged to everyone, and nobody would have known. Julie was quiet for a moment. "But you did see it," she said, "and you did something about it." I looked out at the street, the same street I'd lived on for 12 years, the same houses, the same neighbors walking dogs and checking mail and living their lives. It all looked the same as it had before I'd stumbled onto that deed transfer, but something had shifted underneath, something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was just the loss of a certain kind of innocence, the comfortable assumption that the people in charge were trustworthy because they'd never given me a reason to doubt them. I wouldn't make that assumption again. Not here, not anywhere. The system had worked, but only because someone had used it.
If you've made it this far, here's what I want you to take with you. Teresa Brooks didn't get away with it because she was clever. She got away with it for years because nobody was paying attention. Homeowners trusted the board to handle things. The board trusted the president. And the president trusted that no one would ever bother to check the records. That's the lesson. Not that HOAs are corrupt. Most aren't. Not that you should distrust your neighbors. Most are decent people doing their best. The lesson is simpler. Verify. When something doesn't feel right, look into it. When someone tells you it's too complicated to explain, ask them to explain it anyway. When records are public, actually read them. You don't need a badge to access property records. You don't need a law degree to understand your HOA's bylaws. You just need time, patience, and the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. I'm Michael Vincent, and this has been Fallout HOA. If you've experienced something similar, an HOA that didn't add up, a board that couldn't answer basic questions, a transaction that seemed designed to avoid scrutiny, share it in the comments. Not for drama, for awareness. Because patterns only become visible when people compare notes. Document everything. Trust the process. And never assume someone else is watching. See you in the next one.
There is also one more short story, and we'll discuss our thoughts on it as well. HOA warned me over a trash can on pickup day. This is exhausting. I'm so tired of HOAs acting like they own people's lives. Today I got a warning because my trash can was visible from the street for a few hours. It was literally trash pickup day. I took it out, went to work, came back. And apparently that small window of time was a problem. What really pisses me off is the double standard. There are houses here that leave their cans out all week, park wherever they want, break actual rules all the time, and nothing happens. But the moment you slip once, you get a notice like you've done something illegal. I pay my dues. I keep my place clean. I don't bother anyone. And still I get micromanaged over the dumbest stuff by people who clearly have way too much time on their hands. How is this normal? Why does owning a place still feel like being supervised another story? In 22, I bought my first property in a townhouse community, met my neighbors, started attending HOA meetings regularly. Never missed one, actually. 99% of my neighbors were and are amazing. There's always one, right? I am a professional HVAC technician by trade and drove a 22 Mercedes Spryrer van, commercially wrapped with commercial logos. This was essentially the origin of the feud. Unbeknownst to me, I was in violation of the rules and regulations. I decided to fight this rule and lobby my neighbors for change. Since it's a working class to retired neighborhood, I also started letting my older cat outside to roam freely, completely permitted by HOA rules and regulations, also authorized by my city ordinance. Well, that really was the straw that broke the camel's back with her. She viciously reported my commercial vehicle violation daily and complained publicly at meetings about my cat trying to provoke and stir the neighbors to also take up arms against me. I decided to print and distribute 168 flyers, encouraging neighbors to attend the next meeting so we could meet a quorum. 20 people showed up, enough to satisfy the quorum requirement. But the HOA decided to overrule and force a formal vote where everyone could have an input on it. At the same time, I also learned and studied the HOA rules and regulations out of spite. Everyone eventually breaks the rules at some point, right? Well, I learned the one lady with a problem was in violation of the single dog policy, so I started viciously reporting her violations. Part of the rules when reporting a violation requires a picture of the violation, so daily when she would walk her 2 dogs, I would go out of my way and walk up to her, take her picture and walk away and email the violation off. So now the HOA decided to force a vote on both issues, to allow commercial vehicle parking and to allow 2 dogs. After some contentious debate in the vote, the results determined there was enough votes overwhelmingly to pass the commercial vehicle policy, but not the 2-dog policy, which was interesting since it's mostly a dog community and most people have more than 1 dog. This infuriated the lady, and the HOA decided not to enforce either rule and not to change the rules since it would cost unnecessary money to attorneys. 6 months later, after a decade in the community, she put her house up for sale and moved.
Honestly, this story feels like a perfect example of how HOA conflicts can spiral out of control when one person turns things personal. You tried to engage the community the right way, showing up, organizing neighbors, learning the rules, and pushing for change through proper channels. It's frustrating that what started as a working-class reality, a work van, a cat allowed by law, turned into a personal vendetta. While things clearly escalated on both sides, it's telling that the community largely supported your position. In the end, it sounds less like you won and more like the situation burned everyone out, especially her. HOA drama really can bring out the worst in people.